Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be previewing the Sharks 2021 season. The season starts in just under 2 weeks. Training camp has opened for the Sharks as well as the 6 other teams that failed to make it into the play-in stages of last year's playoffs. Those 6 teams being the Ducks, the Kings, the Sabres, the Red Wings, the Senators, and the Devils. And while most seasons the Sharks lineup has been relatively easy to predict, this past season and this current season there are really only a few positions that seem quite obvious, those being the top 6 for the Sharks, the top 5 defensemen, as well as the 2 goaltenders we will see mostly for this season. Otherwise, the other positions, 7 of them, are relatively murky question mark type of things. So for the top 6, while we do not exactly know what lines we are going to end up seeing, we do know the 6 players we will likely see a lot of, those being Labanc, Couture, Meier, and Kane, Hertl, and Donato. Donato is obviously the one question mark. He doesn't necessarily have this spot in the top 6 locked down just as much as the other 5 players. However, come game 1, I'd be very surprised to see Donato not with a top 6 spot, but at some point during the regular season, depending on how other players on the team perform, they could potentially get promoted above Donato if he's not looking so hot in that spot. However, besides Couture and Hertl, who will likely be 1A, 1B centers for the entire season, the position of the 4 wingers can absolutely change. We may end up seeing Labanc with Couture and Kane. We might end up seeing Meier with Kane and Hertl. We might end up seeing Donato with Couture and Kane. And basically every combination will likely be tried unless the Sharks really find one specific combination that works very, very well. Moving on to the bottom 6 is where we have the biggest question marks for the Sharks this season. A lot of teams do have a pretty settled bottom 6. The Sharks are not one of them. The only 2 players who I would really see being able to almost certainly make it into this bottom 6 come game night are Sorensen, because he's likely the best player available here, depending on how he does, I guess, in training camp, as well as Patrick Marleau, just because of the, fact that if he plays enough games this season, he'll be the player in the NHL ever with the most games played. So I suspect that Booner will do him sort of the respect of playing him at least for the start of the season, and he won't be riding the bench all that much. Otherwise, the other 4 spots are very much up in the air. I have at the moment established Gambrell as the 3rd line center. While Gambrell hasn't necessarily been as great as the Sharks have probably hoped in the past couple of years, he has still been decent enough to be a bottom tier NHL player, and so I suspect he'll likely get a look in the lineup at least come game 1. And for the 4th line as center, I had Shellman. Shellman made his debut with the Sharks last season and was actually a pretty effective 4th line center, made up a very strong 4th line at the time with Melker Karlsson and Stefan Noesen for the Sharks, and so I suspect he may get another look at that. Then as wingers on that 4th line, I have both Noesen and Nieto, mostly because both these players were brought in as unrestricted free agents. Nieto from the Avalanche, Noesen, the Sharks were already had him from having picked him up off of waivers last season, so I suspect because they are older, because they are these unrestricted free agents, they'll probably have the priority look, but anything can really happen in training camp, and any of these possible 10 players could find their way into the lineup. Starting off here with Bergman, he had a couple of decent looks last season, looked to be a potential strong 4th liner for the Sharks, but never really panned out. Blichfeld, a bit more of an offensive option, also had a couple of looks last season, but never really impressed offensively. Then there is Suomela. He was not a mainstay, but had a decent role with the Sharks a couple of years back with De Boer. He was playing with Jonas Donskoy at the time, and they actually made up a decent duo, but De Boer wasn't a huge fan of Suomela. Eventually, he was demoted to the AHL, where he did not perform exceptionally well, and hasn't really seen any consistent time with the Sharks since then. There is also Noah Gregor. He's gotten a few games with the Sharks, at least in this past season. Also more of a two-way option if the Sharks are looking for that. Then there is Sasha Chmelevski. He's a decent rookie winger who could potentially make or something happen. Also a center. He's a bit of a flex, if I'm not mistaken. Could make something happen on the wings in the bottom 6. Then there's Helbigewatz, probably a bit of an outside option to actually be able to make the team because he's a bit more offensive, but he's also a smaller player. player, so if he isn't really higher up in the lineup, he might not make a huge impact as a fourth liner, but still technically an option. John Leonard, a very strong college player for the San Jose Sharks. They've signed him and he's going to get an opportunity to try to make it to the team. He's definitely a very viable option to make it on a fourth or maybe even third line, and is probably one of the few players who could potentially even push for a second line spot over Ryan Donato, along with players like Sorensen and potentially even Patrick Marleau. Then there is Handemark. He was brought in from Europe during this past offseason. Definitely a very, very strong option for fourth or third line. A very good centerman when he was in Europe. He's, I believe, 25 years old, so also one of the more experienced centermen, if you could say that for a 25-year-old, that the Sharks have available as options. Then there is Maxim Latunov, also maybe a bit more of an outside option here, kind of like Helbigawat, mostly because I feel as though Gambrell, Shellman, potentially even Handemark as well, are all above him in terms of centers on the depth chart. And then finally, Alex True. I believe he is injured at the moment for training camp, so I do not know if he will actually be available for the start of the regular season, but he also had a couple of looks last season. He could technically make it onto the squad. Onto the defense, the top five, as I said, are more or less locked in. Vlasic, Karlsson, Shemek, Burns, and then Ferraro, with the sixth defenseman spot being a bit of an option. Not as many options as the Sharks have at forward, but at the moment it seems as though Middleton is the front runner to get that sixth spot. I've never been a huge fan of Middleton, but at the very least he seems to be a somewhat serviceable sixth defenseman. Not super impressive, but he does have that spot at the moment. A couple of options I've outlined here. The thing is that right-handed defenseman compared to left-handed defenseman is something that the Sharks might want to go for. So someone like Pasichnuk, he is a left-handed defenseman, so I don't know if he's necessarily a prime candidate for the spot, but of course he is a player that the Sharks, I believe, have signed during this I guess you could call it off-season, at least since the season got cancelled back in March. Now I can say March last year, so I don't know if he's a huge option for this spot, but definitely has the skill to potentially be a sixth defenseman. Then there is, of course, Ryan Merkley. He could potentially round out the extremely offensively oriented right defenseman that the Sharks could run with Karlsson, Burns, and Merkley. Imagine that. That would be pretty crazy. Merkley, obviously the most skilled of these four players, but we do not know necessarily if he is ready for NHL action, but it could technically happen. And then otherwise, the third option being, technically third option being Nick DeSimone, has been in the Shark system for a couple of years now. I don't know if he'll be able to pass Middleton. However, if you consider that the Sharks are going to be looking for a right-handed defenseman, that could eliminate Pasichnuk, and if you're thinking maybe Merkley isn't 100% ready to play, the only player that DeSimone has to sort of do better than is Jacob Middleton, so it's very possible we see him get into the lineup anyway, but Middleton, as I said, front runner at the moment, would not be surprised to see him get game one. And then finally, for goaltenders, yes, there are multiple other options that the Sharks could go with, but because Dubnyk has been brought in, and he only has this 1 year left on his deal, I'd be extremely surprised if we saw anyone beside Jones or Dubnyk at any point, except due to injury, during this upcoming season. While there is a question of who's going to be the 1A and who is going to be the 1B in this situation, I would expect Jones to be the 1A just because of the seniority, at least with the Sharks, that he has. Now moving on to the division. I had talked about this when I was talking about the NHL's return to play action, but the divisions had not yet been ironed out completely. At first it looked like the Sharks would have the Dallas Stars and the St. Louis Blues in their division with them, but eventually the Stars were pushed out into the Central Division and the Minnesota Wild were brought into the now named West Division, because they can't really call it the Pacific Division anymore, since a few of these teams like St. Louis, like Minnesota, are absolutely nowhere near the Pacific Coast. I mean, Minnesota is probably closer to the Atlantic Coast than they are to the Pacific Coast, if I'm not mistaken, if my geography is on point there. So in this division, it's pretty clear who the top two teams of the division will be. Both the Avalanche and the Golden Knights were top two in the Western Conference last season, and I see very little reason to believe that they've gotten any worse. In fact, you could very well make the argument the Avalanche have gotten actually significantly better since last season, and they were already very good. The Golden Knights, you could maybe say, is more of a lateral move. They upgraded Schmidt with Pietrangelo, which is obviously huge, but they did also lose Paul Stastny in the process, so it's kind of hard to say whether or not it is going to generally make them better, but it probably won't make them much worse. And since they were already the two best teams, they likely will remain as such. In terms of third place, while this is a bit less of a lock, I would be surprised to see the St. Louis Blues get knocked off of that pedestal. The Blues have gotten technically a touch worse, losing Pietrangelo for Torrey Krug instead from the Boston Bruins. Krug is, I would say, a worse defenseman than Pietrangelo, certainly not as well-rounded. However, Krug's still very good. The St. Louis Blues still just a couple of years removed from having won the Stanley Cup, and while I don't have necessarily much faith in Binnington in being the starting goaltender, the other 5 teams in this division are a bit more inconsistent, to say the least. However, it is the top 4 spots of each division that will make it to the playoffs. So while the Golden Knights, the Avalanche, and potentially the Blues have those top 3 spots more or less locked down, it is that 4th and final spot that will really be fought over, and it's hard to say who will actually have the advantage. The Sharks will have to beat out the Kings, the Wild, the Coyotes, and the Ducks. Obviously, the Sharks just a couple of years ago were an extremely competitive team, a top 4 team in the NHL, at least in playoff-wise. They made it to the Western Conference Finals. But this past season was obviously not very good for them. They, along with the Kings and the Ducks in this division, did not make it to the playoffs. It was the Coyotes who were the team who made it the furthest of these 5, getting to the first round and losing to the Avalanche, while the Wild lost in the play-in rounds to the Minnesota Wild. Or to the Vancouver Canucks, I should say. Now, when we look at these teams, the Coyotes, I would say, have gotten pretty noticeably worse. Even though Taylor Hall was never hugely effective with the Coyotes, he's still a very good player, and losing him is not going to be an easy thing to replace. They also ended up trading away Derek Stepan to the Ottawa Senators as well. So the Coyotes, I would say, have taken a step back, and they weren't necessarily so many steps forward anyway in front of the Sharks. The Minnesota Wild could potentially be a dangerous option. They still have some decent names on defense, and their forward group, while not fantastic, does have some pretty decent players like Kevin Fiala, who had really stepped up this past season. The biggest question for the Minnesota Wild is, of course, the goaltending. I don't necessarily believe Alex Stalock to be a very good starting goaltender, but they have brought in Cam Talbot. Talbot, however, as well, hasn't really been a starter since that 1 year with Edmonton where he really sort of overperformed, and since then hasn't necessarily been all that great. He was okay with the Flames last season, so the Wild do have that question mark. And when it comes to the Ducks and the Kings, both those teams are still in the middle of a rebuild. Will this be the year that they sort of pop out of it? You never know. It could happen. It might not happen. The Ducks do still have a couple of decent names on their team. Getzlaf or Raquel can have some younger players step in, and of course any team backstopped by John Gibson certainly has any chance to win on any given night, so you never know with the Ducks. On the Kings side, this is still a team that does have that championship pedigree. They still have Kopitar, Carter, Doughty, Quick. All these players were on the championship teams from 2012 and 2014, but of course the Kings haven't really been competitive since 2014. Their only year that they made the playoffs since then was 2016, where they are. Yes, I believe. 2017. I don't exactly remember the year that they made it, but they ended up getting swept by the Vegas Golden Knights, so not really all that competitive there. Oh, they also made it in 2016 where they lost in 5 games to the Sharks, actually, in the first round. So Kings haven't really been a super competitive team since 2014 when they won the Cup, but they also have a ton of young players who could potentially flood into the lineup this season. Quinton Byfield, their second overall pick from just this past draft, could definitely make an impact, so you never know with them either. So the Sharks will have their hands full, but at the very least, the West Division is predicted to be one of the weaker divisions of the 4, so if there was ever a time for the Sharks to get back into the playoffs, this would be that year. Class dismissed.